Panelists will emphasize specifically on policy recommendations and as they relate to the National Black Lives Matter platform. The esteemed panel are Dr. Ivory Toldson. Dr. Toldson is a professor of counseling psychology at Howard University, the president of Quality Education for Minorities, the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Negro Education, and executive editor of the Journal of Policy Analysis and Research published by the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. He is also the author of Brill's bestseller, No BS. Black people need Black people who believe in Black people enough not to believe every bad thing they hear about Black people. Dr. Toldson is ranked among the nation's top education professors by Education Week's EduScholar Public Influence Ranking. This is an annual list that recognizes university-based scholars across the nation who are champions in shaping educational practice and policy. Dr. Toldson was previously appointed by President Barack Obama to be the executive director of the White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges and Universities. In this position, he worked with the U.S. Secretary of Education to devise national strategies to sustain and expand federal support to HBCUs. Welcome, Dr. Toldson.
Thank you.
We also have Dr. Christopher Emdin from Columbia University. He is an associate professor in the Department of Mathematics, Science, and Technology at Teachers College, Columbia University. He also serves as Associate Director of the Initiative for Urban and Minority Education. Dr. Emdin is the creator of the #HipHopEd social media movement and science genius with the acronym BATTLES. He is the author of the award-winning book, Urban Science Education for Hip Hop Generation, and the New York Times bestseller for White Folks Who Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too. Dr. Emdin was named the 2015 Multicultural Educator of the Year by the National Association of Multicultural Educators, and he has been honored as a STEM Access Champion of Change by the White House under President Obama. He hasn't joined us yet, but we will key him in once he gets here. And last but not least, I want to welcome back home Mr. Maurice Mitchell. Welcome home. He was a student in the political science department. Mr. Mitchell, a proud Bison, is a nationally recognized strategist. He's a visionary leader in the movement of Black Lives and the national director of the Working Families Party. He is building the Working Families Party to be the political home for a multi-racial working class movement to fight for the many and not the few. Welcome home, Mr. Mitchell. Again, I will serve as the moderator for this panel. And Dr. Toldson, let's start with you. Why are we here and why are we having this discussion? And what, again, are some of the policy recommendations related to the National Black Lives Matter platform?
Yeah. Well, thanks for organizing this session. And, you know, I've been at Howard University since 2015, 2005. I'm here. I've been here for about 15 years now, and the history and legacy of Howard University is very important to the nation's understanding of the current movements as well as historic movements. I've also had the honor of being the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Negro Education for over a decade, and one of the recent editorial comments that I published looked at Black consciousness movements throughout the history of Black people post-Civil War and looked at who the editor of the Journal of Negro Education was, and did kind of a look at some of the scholarship that was published in J&E, mostly coming from Howard, certainly published by Howard University since 1932. And so I looked at the New Negro movement, which was roughly around the 1900s to the 1940s. So the Journal of Negro Education started during the New Negro movement, where there were a lot of Black people who was contributing to the United States in some significant ways. They were starting to fight in wars. They were thinking about their own intellectual capital. There was a Harlem Renaissance, and there was this huge Black intellectual movement that happened around that time. We followed that with the Civil Rights Movement onto the Black Power era, onto the Afrocentric era, and now we have the Black Lives Matter era. And I think it's important for us to understand that continuity, to understand that Black consciousness is something that has been with us really since we've been in this nation, well before the Civil War, and the current Black Lives Matter is an evolution of a lot of strategies from the past. I think what makes the Black Lives Matter movement unique is that it's gone away from the idea of the charismatic leader that leads a major movement. It's a more decentralized movement. It's not as rooted in theology, but more so rooted in some of the new ways in which we use technology, and also understand Blackness beyond understand the intersectionality of Blackness. In terms of policy, I think it has a lot of implications for how we think about education, the criminal justice system, healthcare, and everything in society where we can see that Black lives are not given the priority and the attention that they deserve. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that, but those are my opening observations.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Toldson. Dr. Emdin, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. I had a little bit of issues with the technology and navigating Zoom, but I'm glad to be able to join you guys today, particularly with the wonderful set of colleagues that we have on here. Particular kudos to my brother, Dr. Toldson. I've written for J&E, your stewardship of that journal, and a sort of the way that you've held on to the historical traditions with such brilliance, and still connecting this to the community is something that I marvel in how you've done it. And so I'm humbled to share space with you, as well as Shalandra and Maurice.
Thank you.
So my general thoughts are quite simple. I think when we have conversations around moving Black Lives Matter from practice to policy, there must be a recognition first that there has been no policy around the sustenance of Black folks who would benefit from policy. And so I think that we kind of need to take a step back rather than start looking at this as, what kind of Black Lives Matter policies can we implement? We should talk more broadly about what kind of policies need to be implemented to make Black folks feel whole enough to want to partake in a political process that may benefit from policy. And I think the idea around mental health, around sort of economic stability, are outside of some of the strands of Black Lives Matter's articulations organizationally, but it's about a more broad and robust and complex process of practices around Black wholeness that we need to focus on first. I think once that happens, we won't need a set of intellectuals from Ivy League institutions or other esteemed institutions articulating what the path forward is, because the folks in communities who are impacted will be so empowered because they're not concerned about the minutiae of life. My issue now is that even as we talk about the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, is that there's a wide swath of the population in Black communities who are disengaged even from that conversation. I mean, we got folks in the hood who will rock a t-shirt or will rise up a fist or will nod to and put a post on IG, but the kind of large groundswell of engagement of folks within communities does not exist because Black folks are preoccupied with survival. You know what I mean? We're trying to get a gig to try to navigate what it feels like and looks like and sounds like to put food on the table for my babies in this moment where it's great that folks are protesting, but I don't got the luxury to protest because I got to go get some bread. And so I think the larger sort of socioeconomic conditions of our people need to be written into policy and then have those folks help us to determine what the next steps and frontiers are of our wholeness. I do think that the movement is powerful. I do think that it's been distributed, at least folks have all heard about it. My concern is that not everybody is still actively engaged in and with it. And it's for a lack of, the flexibility to engage, but also a certain apathy that we have to recognize. Some folks have been so disengaged from the conversations around political movements or protest movements that they just like, whatever. We see that right now with voting. There's no reason why our people in this moment are not fully invested in what's going on when it comes to making decisions about the next couple years in this country as far as the political leadership and executive branch. But even so, we have disengagement. That disengagement, that apathy is a function of not having basic needs met that have not been written into policy. And so I think this idea of distributing the ideology has been phenomenal, but it must come concurrently with distributing the resources, distributing the ability to be able to engage in dialogue, and also, last piece, distributing the kind of hyper academic and intellectual ways that the conversations around Black Lives Matter is existing. It's a lot of folks with letters after their names who are making all the decisions. And in doing so, erasing the genius sisters that may not have all them letters who constructed the movement. And we in many ways are having a reclaiming of a moment other folks created without ensuring that those folks are part of the conversation in the next frontier. So for me, it's about policy around truly actualizing democracy, fullness, wellness, and wholeness. And then we can have some more specific conversations around Black Lives Matter's sort of tenets organizationally and what that may look like in policy.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Mitchell.
Thank you, Dr. Ellison, and it's a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Toldson, Dr. Edom. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
You're almost there. It's M like Malcolm and Din like dinner. Emdin.
Okay. Well, it's Emdin. It's a pleasure to come back home. I was a student at Howard in the late 90s, and it's just great to be at the Mecca and be part of this conversation with all of you. So, and that's where I kind of want to start. I want to sort of just, if you don't mind, if you'll indulge me, just bring in a little biography because I think it helps place me in this conversation. So, I've been organizing most of my life, including when I was at Howard. And at Howard, one of the first direct actions I ever organized was around the police murder of Prince Jones. That moment really politicized and radicalized a lot of the students that were on campus at that time. And, for those of you that are familiar with Ta-Nehisi Coates' best-selling book, Between the World and Me, he actually writes about that episode in our history and what Prince's story meant to so many people. After I graduated from Howard in the early 2000s, my family and my life was impacted by Hurricane Sandy. Then a year and a half afterwards, Michael Brown was murdered. And I, including many other people, responded to the murder of Michael Brown and the uncommon courage of the folks on the ground in Ferguson. And to your point, these are working class, everyday working class, genius, courageous Black folks in the St. Louis area and in the suburb of Ferguson who rose up and inspired us all and sparked this iteration of the movement. And we owe all of them a continued debt of gratitude. I, like others, responded to
their courage and began to organize with organizations like the Organization for Black Struggle in St. Louis, who are on the front lines of that battle, as well as many, many individuals and many organizations. And those of us that were on the ground there and in other places helped to build what would become the movement for Black lives. And, you know, here we are in 2020, and our movement has become, you know, this is both, we didn't need the New York Times to document this, but, you know, the New York Times has documented the fact that this movement is the largest protest movement, social movement in US history, right? It's Black led, it's multiracial, it's in every region, it's not just in cities. We've had actions in response to the conditions on the ground, which aren't simply just about policing, right? Like, people were protesting the conditions of Black folks. And this is a reckoning on, yes, absolutely, the 4 months of COVID-19, including the unique way that Black folks are being policed during COVID. And also the secondary impacts, not just the health impacts, but the mental health impacts and the economic impacts of COVID, and the social impacts of being socially distanced, or at least physically distanced from so many people. The last 4 years of Trump's unique form of republicanism, right? Because, you know, people like to talk about him as an aberration, but we know that the far right has been organizing this agenda for years. The last 40 years, which has really marked the neoliberal era, which has been about disinvesting from Black folks, significantly disinvesting from our communities, disinvesting from working people in general. And then the last 4 decades, right? 1619 to 2019, 2020, almost perfectly 4 centuries of our existence in this continent as colonized and enslaved people. All of that is wrapped into what 2020 is, right? And the explosion that took place, it's not just about George Floyd, but it absolutely is about George Floyd. It's both and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and many, many other people that we don't know. Now, in terms of the policy, like, one of the things that folks who have been detractors of our movement have always attempted to do is to try to decontextualize us, right? And from the very beginning, we've been very clear that policing and the extrajudicial killing and murdering of Black people by the state is the most egregious form of state violence against Black people, but it isn't the only form, right? Like, state violence is also housing policy, also healthcare policy. All of these policies that either limit the ability for Black people to thrive and enjoy our lives, or actually limit the lengths of our lives, those are very real forms of violence, right? And so we've always had this robust conversation that media, opinion, and others have attempted to sort of basically relegate to policing. When we understand that it's a web of systems, and policing is the most brutal sort of tool in the arsenal that is used in order to control Black bodies, right? And in order to socially control Black communities. And we from the very beginning have been very forthright in having a more nuanced, intersectional conversation about the race, class, and gender dynamics of Black lives every single day. We don't simply want to stop police killings, although we do want to do that. We want to create a condition where Black people can thrive, where Black people are determining for ourselves what our communities look like, self-determined Black communities. In those communities, we could decide what public safety looks like, right? And we talk about public safety, not just policing. And there's been this conversation about defunding the police. That conversation really is about investing and self-determination. Just like over the past 40 years, our states and localities and the federal government have disinvested from us strategically, right? So you could, you know, from the mid 70s on, that's the beginning of the era of mass incarceration, where our states and our federal government has been aggressively investing in policing, jails, and prisons, and at the same time disinvesting from the commons, from education, from healthcare, from all types of programs that ensure that we have an opportunity to be whole people. We want to reverse that. The defund the police phrase, the defund the police chant, is about reversing that, disinvesting from militarizing policing and reinvesting in our communities. And the last thing I'll say is so what that does is it sets up a policy terrain that challenges the austerity politics of the far right, and not just the far right, but many people who have D's next to their name. There is like a neoliberal consensus across Democrats and Republicans around austerity, and you're absolutely going to hear, because of the economic dynamics on the local level, Democrat elected officials talking about cuts. We want to challenge that and talk about investing in order to open up the possibilities for robust public policy that's people-centered. And then the last thing I'll say is that, and we want to have an explicit conversation about Black people, because Black people have a unique relationship to this country and a unique relationship to the wealth of this country because of the hundreds of years of wage theft that has been meted upon us. The conversation about reparations, of repairing the harms, the historical harms to Black folks is critical. Yes, we need to have an economic agenda that supports working people in general, and we need to have a Black agenda that uniquely identifies how Black people could thrive. We're always talking about how we could thrive and how we could fully live out the full potential that we have in our communities. And so, I'll just end. The Movement for Black Lives has authored the Breathe Act, which speaks to that. The Breathe Act is not just about policing, it's about investing in our communities. Of course, it's about ending violent policing, but it's about so much more. The Movement for Black Lives also endorsed the Thrive Act, which is another sort of position around how we invest at a time when millions of people have lost their jobs, how we're investing in ensuring that people have good jobs that build our communities and rebuild our economy and move us away from an economy that is extractive. And, there's an opportunity now. We're faced just weeks before this election where we might double down on the politics of cynicism, despair, and fear, or we might have an opportunity to move in another direction. I've often talked about Biden and Harris as being a door, not a destination. It's an opportunity for us to have this conversation about going on the offensive and building this robust sort of policy that's rooted in our communities. I couldn't agree more. Oftentimes the policy conversation is either very academic or it's inside the beltway where insiders are kind of like tooling around, but we need to have a policy agenda that's rooted in the lived experience of working people and the lived experience of everyday Black people who are getting up every single day trying to hustle in order to just stay safe in a very, very chaotic, very, very dangerous environment for our people.
Okay, Dr. Toldson, who are we holding responsible for this? Who are we holding responsible for this policy transformation?
We all have to be a part of the solution. And I think the first responsibility lies on us, Black people, to be able to articulate and assert the things that we need. And Dr. Emdin did a wonderful job of understanding how we need to get there, so we don't trivialize the apathy or the I guess lack of motivation among some to really be a part of the change. So we have to create more educational opportunities. I think and every generation has a situation that leads to a new awakening, and it's important to capitalize off of that awakening. I know with my mother and her generation, and she's just shy of being a baby boomer. On the older side, she would be considered a part of that greatest generation, which was a segregationist era. But her generation's moment, among Black people, was the murder of Emmett Till, and she vividly remembers when Emmett Till was murdered. And she remembers how that affected other children her age. And she was a little bit older than Emmett Till, uh, just shy of being a teenager. But it was the way that Emmett Till's family handled that horrific incident, the way that his mother demanded that people see what they did to her baby, that led to, that sparked movements after that. And, you know, it's important, you know, we think of Emmett Till's murder as being this historic event. It's really a current affair. 30% of all white people in the United States right now was alive when Emmett Till was murdered. Donald Trump was 9 years old when Emmett Till was murdered. No one has ever asked Donald Trump, you know, where was he when Emmett Till was murdered? He probably doesn't remember because it didn't affect him the same way that it affected my mother. I do believe that Trayvon Martin's murder was an Emmett Till type moment for Black people in a new generation. I remember, you know, the George Zimmerman trial and when he was acquitted, and you know, just the knowledge that someone can murder somebody, a white person can follow somebody, stalk somebody, and murder them, and not go to jail. You know, I'm sure it was you know, the feeling that I had was the same way that people in my mother's generation felt when those murderers were acquitted of killing Emmett Till. And there was a momentum, and you know, his parents, they also, you know, handled the grief in a way that helped the Black community to understand that this is a moment that you know, don't let my son's murder be in vain. You know, understand it, reflect on it, strategize. And in many ways, the Black Lives Matter movement was spawned from that moment, much in the same way that the Civil Rights movement was spawned from the murder of Emmett Till. So all of this, embedded in all of this is, you know, responsibilities, our responsibility to make sure that when tragedy happens, we capitalize off of it in a way that, and I hate to use the word capitalize, but we understand the moment in a way that pushes us to reach people who may not have understood the gravity of the situation before, to help people to clarify and personally connect with what's going on, and to make movements going further. Maurice talked about a lot of very important aspects of what we need to do. He also talked about the defund the police movement, which, you know, is very important. I just want to add some data that supports what he was saying. And I posted this on Facebook a while back. But you know, if we look at the police, if we look at police budgets, you know, like New York's police budget is $6 billion. Los Angeles, Chicago, 1.8 billion. Houston, Atlanta, and DC all have police budgets that are approaching a billion. And so if we did modest reductions, a 20% reduction across all of those budgets, if we just look at New York, if New York took a 20% hit in their police department's budget, they would still have 4.8 billion. So it's hard for me to understand any entity or agency that can't do their jobs with 4.8 billion. And if you had that 20% reduction across all those major cities that I just listed, we're talking about $2.4 billion to do something other than policing to prevent crime. So I think defunding the police and expanding other services would lead to a crime reduction. And I think there's data that supports that. So it's important for us to all collectively, you know, use the gifts that God gave us, and use moments of tragedy and sorrow to you know, work for a better future. Certainly the generations before me And, I thank God for, my mother, father, stepfather. My stepfather was Mario Wadelli, who was the president of the Republic of New Africa. My mother was co-chair of COBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, before anybody was talking about reparations in the 90s. She was at the forefront of that. So, connecting our struggle to the past and seeing the way forward in the future is very important to what we need to do.
Mm-hmm. Totally agreed. Dr. Emdin?
Yeah, that. I mean, you both are just so damn brilliant, man. And may I say this, because we have a little bit of time left, I'm wondering if we could engage in the rest of this dialogue with an opportunity for us to engage, the way brothers do too. I always appreciate the beauty of the order of a sort of like engaging, so everyone has equal opportunity for voice. I also always think that, the way that really truthful, engaged, and powerful dialogue emerges is if we could be like, yo, bro, hold up a second. And plus, and so if I may,
Please,
as these brothers engage, kind of interrupt at some points, because, when you both were speaking, there were so many points. Maurice, man, I'm not gonna front, like, I didn't even know your work like that. You spoke and I was like, oh man, let me get to Googling this, brother. So that's a gift. So Doc, I think it's our collective responsibility to echo Brother Ivory, like, everybody has to, one of my favorite quotes, a Frantz Fanon quote, every generation out of relative obscurity must either fulfill its mission or betray it. It's a bastardized version of that quote, but it's like, we all got to take the work up. My thing is, and my stance is that we take the work up, understanding our passions and areas of expertise and sticking to that. And I think that what oftentimes happens in this next frontier of like, so after my initial point about distributing the dialogue to engage with folks who traditionally don't engage, right? Which I think is the first point. That point also specifically relates to education. The only way that you distribute the information, the conversation, the nuances of the dialogue is by teaching. And when I talk about teaching, not just teaching, in school, so not schooling, but education. And in a very Panther-esque, organic kind of way, which is, get a couple young folks together, get a couple grown folks together in a Septimus Clark tradition, right? And say, who want to get down, who got time? Let me build a shot real quick about what's going on. And I think that level of distribution of information is at the anchor of constructing a populace strong enough to really speak truth to power and push for the right policy. And I don't think we do a good enough job at that. I think there's a reliance on institutions to give us the space to articulate the path forward. And whenever you're relying on an institution that ain't designed for you, you ain't gonna never have the space. And I think there's been a colonization of even spaces that have been allowed, right? So there's a colonization of Black studies spaces. There's a colonization of musicology spaces that might connect to ways that we express ourselves. So whenever we're waiting for institutions to give us the road forward, despite the fact that I wholeheartedly love the fact that you, Doc, have created this space, it's an isolated space. Like, we got 26 cats on here right now. And I think that's 26 folks who I'm thankful are joining us. There are 26,000 folks in the hood that could benefit. And so the kind of policy shift around the distribution of information is how do we create opportunities and inroads to have the sort of organic spaces for engagement that allow folks to be a part of the conversation. Like, I'm even thinking about both Maurice's initial point and then Ivory's genius, which he always does, like the way he plays with numbers and make things pop in your head, I just always dig. But the way he talked about funding in New York City and put that in relationship with Maurice's initial point about the funding of the police, let me tell y'all something. I've engaged with folks in my community, right? And when I'm like, yo, and we talking this Black Lives Matter, like, we got to defund the police. And the initial response is simply, defund the police? Somebody run up on my crib, I gotta call the cops, right? And we have to understand the traumatizing nature of that, right? The idea that I have to call the very person I know can oppress me is the only way forward, right? But if they understood the academic, mathematical conversation that Ivory said, like, we saying they got too much bread, and we can get some of that bread, get to y'all, police yourselves, and make sure they do what they're supposed to do. You would have the whole hood talk about defund the police. But the intellectualizing of that phrase and the absence of the nuance and the articulation of it inhibits folks who would otherwise champion it better than we could from engaging in it. And then that concurrently happens, has to have a conversation about, so why do they not engage? So, because I know a counter argument is, well, if that's the case, how come they don't choose to engage? And it's because folks have been traumatized by these experiences. They've been traumatized by folks who look like them. They've been traumatized by Black police officers. They've been traumatized by the Black intellectual folks who don't reach out to communities but always talk about them. They've been traumatized by researchers who do work in urban education and urban studies that come in, do a whole study, then keep it moving, and they get accolades for the work by the folks in the community who did most of the work or who gave you information, like that part. So we have to address policy-wise the traumatizing nature of even our present as a Black intellectual populace, and get rid of the Du Boisian. I mean, no disrespect. And so let me take a step back, because I know Ivory and the Journal and all that, right? But people have misunderstood the concept of the talented 10. They've misunderstood that concept and thought it to mean strive to be part of those who have all the things, and not a reconnection back. And that misinterpretation has siphoned off those who can be the best teachers to go to institutions and teach other folks who would have access to that information anyway. Look, the 26 folks we have here, no shade to y'all, because I don't know y'all. I'm sure any of those people could be on this panel spitting that heat. And so we spitting that heat to each other, heating each other up, and the hood is lost. And so I think that, and also the understanding the trauma in the sense of, renaming traumas and engaging with folks like it's traumatic, right? Don't engage with folks like they've been disengaged. Engage with folks recognizing the trauma that we and institutions and society at large has inflicted, right? Like that PTSD is real if you live in the hood in its various iterations, right? Whether it's a straight up post-traumatic stress disorder out of an interaction with the criminal justice system, or it's a President Trump stress disorder about looking at a person lying every single day and you got to listen to it with no diction, no articulation of a coherent thought, but still having the prominence to be able to reach out to communities, and also having the power to manipulate those who we look to as idols to be able to support their endeavors, Ice Cube. Like the trauma of that, like the dude who said F the police, that made me feel like, yo, we can stand up for something, is co-writing a policy. Yeah. Like that's traumatizing for me. I woke up this morning hurt, and somebody needs to help me heal from that trauma, right? A past folks in the contemporary trying to attack contemporary iterations of the same kind of practices through the practices that our OGs did in the 60s and 70s. I say we learn from our OGs, we listen to them, we help them inform us, but don't replicate it. Replicating what they did ain't gonna work now. It's more nuanced and complex. And I'm all for protesting. I'm all for speaking truth to power. I also understand when you are protesting and, oh man, listen, let me just chill, bro. Because I think that, I'll give you a quick example. I was talking to a brother the other day who invited me to a protest, which that in itself is an oxymoronic kind of thing, right? And I was like, I bet, this being COVID, but I'm gonna do what I gotta do, and I'm gonna show up because I appreciate that, right? And the invitation was, it was like an online invitation, like how the same kind of invitation you get when you go to a party, like it's like was Evite? It was like an Evite to a protest, right? So that was already like real ill. And then after I engaged and spoke some more, he was like, yeah, and the NYPD gave us permission to march on this block to this block from this time to this time. And then we're gonna have, a nice, meal after that. And I was like, that's not protest. I can appreciate the solidarity and gathering, but the idea of taking up the most simplistic parts of a more complex articulation of speaking truth to power historically, because it wasn't just a protest in the 70s. The protest was the final event. It was the planning. So now we're not doing the planning, but we're planning the event. This ain't brunch. Like you don't treat protesting like it's brunch, bro. And I think that's traumatizing for certain folks and makes them want to engage. So President Trump's stress disorder, past tradition stress disorder, and most importantly, as it relates to education, poor teaching and schools disorder. If you want to change the next generation, if you want to fulfill Fanon's mission, you change what happens in schools. We're not having enough conversation about curriculum, about civics, about Black power movements, in the day-to-day experiences of young folks on Zoom right now. Young folks are witnessing out their window protest, on an online platform, right? And then they're learning about, slavery wasn't as bad right now during Zoom. So how do we infiltrate curricular practices to be able to reimagine this process? And I know I said a lot, and it's a lot of tributaries, but I just want to throw that out to the fam, and we can all continue building.
Mr. Mitchell, your head is just going.
Sure. I mean, there's so many threads there. So I appreciate that. I appreciate so much of what you shared, Dr. Emdin. And I want to focus on something from, I'm not an academic. I'm an organizer. And, one of the reasons why I chose organizing kind of speaks to what you were raising. Organizing, when it's done well, ultimately is about creating connection, meaning, and belonging. And in that space of connection, meaning, and belonging, true healing could happen, right? True learning could happen. A true grassroots development of even policy could happen, right? Like part of my organizing training is based on the idea that everyday people, just working class Black folks, are masters and experts in our lived experience, right? And so we don't need to ask for permission, and we don't need to seek the validation of others, of institutions or other people, in order to claim our genius, right? And the people who are most close to the suffering on a day-to-day basis actually have within them the most elegant and sophisticated responses and solutions. And so if you are actually serious about the solutions, you don't go to the academic who has an approach that is removed. Like a lot of the sort of like a lot of the way that the academy presents itself is that because of that distance, it's somehow more scientific, more rooted in and therefore the outcomes are more grounded. I would suggest that distance, that sort of antiseptic distance, is a gap in understanding and context that our people have. Like, and the genius of Black people, of having to navigate all of these systems, having to speak multiple languages, having to go in and out seamlessly of multiple cultures every single day, simply just to survive, puts Black people at a unique advantage. And I'm not talking about Black people who are deeply learned, I'm talking about Black people just in general, in a unique advantage to develop the strategies to save ourselves and to make ourselves whole, but only if we create the conditions, which is why I focus on organizing, the conditions that require trust, that require safety, so that you could shift from a place of scarcity and threat. And we all know that when you're in a scarcity mindset, when you're in a threat mindset, like just biologically, right? It's hard to strategize. Yeah. It's hard to plan. Yeah. It's hard to think straight, right? When you're in that traumatized space, which is one of the reasons why I use organizing as an approach, because when you're in community together, that creates a sense of safety. That creates a sense of equilibrium, where it's like, all right, now we're able to actually engage our reality and analyze our reality in a very sophisticated way so that we could come up with a strategy in order to get up out of this situation. And that's what we've done historically to get us here. Like, I always try to remind folks, if you are a Black person living in this hemisphere, you are the outcome of somebody who lived in the interior of Africa, who somehow survived to get to the west coast of Africa, who somehow survived a slave dungeon, who somehow survived the Middle Passage, who somehow found love and was able to carry a child and do that over and over and over and over again. So within us is a very sophisticated strategy for survival against very, very, very challenging odds. That is within us, but we can't unlock it if we're just constantly at threat. So to speak, I'm really happy that you grounded it in the pathologies of white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy and all these other systems that make it very, very hard on a day-to-day for us to engage in that strategy, which is one of the reasons why up until this day, so much money and resources are spent on preventing us from congregating together as Black folks, preventing us from being able to develop our own institutions so that we could educate ourselves based on our traditions. Like all of those things are designed because clearly there is an understanding that if Black people are able to organize our own spaces, in enough time, we will develop strategies for liberation that will challenge the very systems of power that the ruling class, the white ruling class, need for survival, right? So there is a reason why they're afraid of us.
Can I just say this? Because you just taught me something. I just want to acknowledge that. Because I always want to acknowledge when I'm thought in the moment, in situ, you rethink a perspective. Because, I spoke. So I was real mad at the brother who invited me to the Ivory protest.
Right.
But after you just spoke, you conjured up in my mind the notion of seeing the beauty in the gathering itself as a way to organically construct a path forward, which is very different than how I thought prior to 1230. And so I ain't got to answer that, but I just want to thank you because you've added something else to my thinking, and I appreciate that. That's all. For
sure. I mean, this is a real dialogue. To me, if that gathering is authentically Black and rooted in the community, right, then that's a space for healing. That's a space where if somebody in the community is in that space, over time, that space could work on that person so we could actually breathe and be able to assess, be in my body for the first time, see myself for the first time in a long time, see my brother, my sister, my community for the first time, and then make assessments rooted in that. A lot could be done. Like there's a lot of reasons to create spaces, right? Like definitely for direct action. Like if we want to bang on the police, that is definitely like and I've done a lot of that. And simply just being in space in a truly organic Black-based space. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I went to Howard, right? Right? Because Howard at its best provides some of that. We're not going to talk about Howard at its worst, but Howard at its best provides some of that, right? And Black institutions at their best, like connection, meaning, belonging. And from that grounding, there's so many things we could do. Then we could build a strategy.
Yeah. Yo, here's another thing too. If it were not for Howard, I wouldn't even be here. My parents were Howard undergrad students. And so their union began on that campus, which is another iteration of just gathering.
Yeah.
To create the build. So thank you, Kane. Appreciate that.
Sure.
Yeah. I also want to touch on what you said about the academic and the organizer, because you started off by saying I'm not an academic, I'm an organizer, and I think you tied those two concepts together well. But it kind of struck me because taking a step back to what Dr. Emdin said about Ice Cube, and I was also very taken aback by what I saw on social media. And there's a quote that I always use from Ice Cube in a lot of my speaking engagements. And I'll set it up saying, there's a philosopher that we can learn a lot from, and I say Ice Cube. And now I got to reevaluate whether or not that needs to be a permanent part of that.
And here's the thing with that too. I agree, like a good doctor, and here's the thing, in the midst of that, we can't cancel Q.
We can't.
I think that's another piece of all of this, right?
Right.
We've not talked about yet, because Ice Cube is still Ice Cube, right? Ice Cube is invoked so much in us. And while this is a hurtful gaffe, he's still our brother, one.
Yeah.
He's
absolutely.
still Ice Cube. And how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, but this is what he said that I say all the time. But ask yourself, who are they for us to be equal to?
Yeah.
And so, and I say that all the time in the context of, Black people trying to achieve, and they use white standards as their definition of what success should look like.
That part.
And that pervades, so many different things, from, the achievement gap, to, just looking at housing, like there was a article that talked about how house prices are depressed in Black neighborhoods, but they never talked about the houses being inflated in white neighborhoods.
Right.
Now, truth be told, the house prices in Black neighborhoods is probably what they should be for an equitable society.
That's right.
That part.
Yeah.
The houses in the white neighborhoods, they need to change.
That's right.
If the house prices in Black neighborhoods just increase to match those, then we would just further the economic gaps that exist. That's not that's not a socially conscious way of thinking. So we always have to think about how we are defining success and make sure that white definitions of success is out of that equation. And everybody on this panel has been exemplars of that. I mean, Dr. Emdin wrote a book called "For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood," and the rest of y'all too, Ebonics, in the title. And my book starts off saying soul food didn't come from emulating white cooks. Jazz, hip hop, and rock and roll didn't come from emulating white musicians, and good Black research won't come from emulating white scholars.
That's right.
So we always have to think about that. But going back to academic versus organizer, because the first thing I thought when you talked about when you said I'm not an academic, I'm an organizer, first thing I thought was I've never met a good academic that wasn't also a good organizer. And I've never met an organizer that wasn't also an academic. And I don't mind sharing the academic title.
Yeah.
I don't mind calling someone an academic that don't have the letters behind their name. I believe in Ubuntu. So I am because we are.
Indeed.
And so I also believe in connecting it to some of the changes, the distributed agency that happened with the Black Lives Matter movement. Another aspect of distributed agency is expanded cognition. So we should all acknowledge that because we have technological devices, you have the same information that I have.
Yeah.
It's up to us to dialogue and have a shared understanding of that information. But, the numbers that I put out, and, people, always call me the stat guy, the numbers guy. This is in the 1990s. These numbers aren't exclusive. And so we have to be in a position to understand our own collective struggle in a way that doesn't have the interference of Western conceptuation of what a movement should look like.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Colleagues, we have 2 minutes.
Oh, man.
Okay.
I know, we want to continue this dialogue. I'm like, can we
I
continue
had my
it?
calendar blocked off till 1:30. I'm sorry.
I'm going to share my final words really quickly. I'm just so deeply thankful to be able to share space with such brilliant folks. Thank you, good Dr. Ellison, for joining us. Brother Maurice, man, I feel almost embarrassed that I wasn't familiar with you more than I am right now. And I'm looking forward to learning more from and about you. Ivory, you know how I feel about you, bro. My only piece of this that I wish would have been better is if we could have heard some sisters' voices, but I know the nature of how these things go and folks go in and out, and there are other panels throughout the day. But other than that, this has been beautiful and brilliant, and I thank you guys so much for convening it.
But we do have a sister's voice, Amber Davis, and I'm old school, so I guess you guys would know what this means. Spit that hit.
That's right.
Okay.
All right.
We were joined by Dr. Holly Walker, Dean of the Law School.
And in closing, this is it means a lot to me, more than you could probably know, to be in a Howard space, in a HU space. And to your point, Dr. Toldson, it always bugged me that people said that Howard was the Black Harvard. I was like, Howard is the Black Howard.
Harvard is a white Howard. That's what
yeah, exactly. Like we don't need to align ourselves with these standards that are outside of our community. But you could call on me at any point that anything has to do with Howard. I'm there, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Oh, you know what? We can continue the conversation because I think we go to 1:30.
Word?
Okay.
Word.
Yeah, we have time. That's why I was going to jump on and say there's nothing after us. So I've been enjoying this conversation so much. I think we should continue it. Don't let us interrupt. We can take it till 1:30.
All right, bet.
Okay. All right. Well, there we go. Well, what I was going to say is that since we have 30 more minutes, what I would say is that I'm looking forward to continuing in any way I can, Dr. Edom, Dr. Ellison, Dr. Toldson, anybody in the Howard community to build on these conversations and figure out how to expand. To your point, Dr. Edom, how do we expand these conversations so they're a dialogue that isn't just for a segment of our community, but is a dialogue that is across race, class, and gender, and is really touching all the different parts of our community. I mean, the one thing I will say about these standards, these Eurocentric and white standards that we place so much value in, like imagine what it would feel like if we let them go, how much creative space we could have if we really let them go, right? And then how useful our institutions would be if our institutions didn't set as our North Star our competition with white America, but set as our North Star the wholeness and the ability for our community to thrive, right? I think that would change our curriculums, that would change how we approach funding our institutions, how we approach building our institutions, how we approach policy. We're talking about policy. But I mean, I think one of the concerns being a colonized people who have this very unique relationship to America where we built this place, but we're meant to feel as somehow apart from this place. To regain I think one of the ways that we regain our agency is by letting go of the standards of the dominant society and embracing our standards. Like I couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Toldson, right? Like the highest level of Black scholarship comes from Black scholars who are approaching their discipline from a Black-centered sort of way. And how are we producing Black scholars and Black organizers and Black people that have standards of success that aren't about keeping up with the Joneses, but are about making our community whole? How do we shift that paradigm? Which speaks to that whole question of like the housing thing. It's like, all right, well, the way that we ultimately view Black success is like whether or not we achieve white wealth standards. But why are we not actually picking apart and challenging how our economy is organized in the first place? Yeah. That's something that I think, you talked about rock and roll and jazz. That is, to me, a Black approach to all these things, actually starting from the root. Like, what is the purpose of an economy? Why are we organizing our economy in this fashion? What would it look like for us to approach economics? What would it look like for us to approach that is, to me, such more exciting terrain to engage with.
Yeah, and it's important. There's commentary that I wrote on a New York Times piece, and I titled it "Dear Black People, Stop Inhaling Liberal Farts," and it was a article that they posted based on Chetty's work, and I think Chetty he's either at Harvard or Stanford. But he talked about the difficulty of Black men in particular transferring wealth intergenerationally. So he did this largely by comparing Black wealth to white wealth, or Black male wealth to white male wealth, and looking at the homes that they grew up in. And he said that even Black men who are in upper middle class households, that grew up in those households, they still don't have wealth that matches white male wealth. Now, he didn't see a problem with Black women because Black women's wealth and white women's wealth were pretty much the same. Now, you know, beyond the commentary, when you look at the numbers, what you actually see is Black male wealth, white women wealth, and Black women's wealth were nearly the same. Mm-hmm. And white men wealth was way off on this other plane. Mm-hmm. So why the hell is the article about us and not about white men? They are the outlier. Yeah. And when you look closer, you know, when you put them in the microscope and not us, you see all these things that white people have said some bad things about, like entitlements. There's a whole bunch of entitlements up in there. Mm-hmm. You see a whole lot of things like, you know, welfare. It's just corporate welfare. You see things like
that's all.
you see things like people. You don't see the things that they complain about, like Black people using food stamps to buy alcohol. You see white men charging tens of thousands of dollars of alcohol for a reception to the federal government. So you got taxpayers paying for alcohol there. You see this thing called passive income, which is essentially making money without working. And they are striving, they're telling us you have to work hard, but they are striving to be in a position to be on the golf course and still make money, even when they're doing it because other people are struggling, not while other people are struggling, but because other people are struggling. So Chetty's work should never be about why Black men don't have as much as white men, especially if what he's seeing is an egalitarian system where the parity between income between Black men and Black men and Black women are so much more similar. Mm-hmm. They should be modeling our race when they talk about achieving some gender equity, you know, in income. So these are the types of questions that we can answer if we stop looking or stop buying into this deficit mindset when it comes to Blackness and this normalization of whiteness.
Yo, and I just would say, because that was so fire, is for me, and I just want to answer Felicia Thompson's question. Mm-hmm. You know, my particular focus, and I can have conversations about a lot of other things, right? But my unique and particular focus is in the transformation of K through 12 education, right? Yeah. And more uniquely in the smaller aspect of science education. And I feel like, you know, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, it has to be a collective identification of where your skill set is best served, not where your skill set best benefits you. Because I keep it a buck with y'all, like my expertise would serve me well in other domains, right? Like my training, undergrad, grad school, I'm an anthobiochemist by training, the mesenchymal stem cell research and the etiology of schizophrenia. Like I could get the bag just doing straight science stuff. You know what I mean? Like, and, yeah. But there was a willingness to sacrifice it wasn't a pursuit of monetary goal per se. It's an understanding that this idea of wealth, and this is back to Ivy's question, like wealth is not monetary to me. Now don't get it twisted, the bag matters, you know what I'm saying? But to secure the financial bag, I gotta secure the emotional, psychological bag. Because if this bag is set, you know what I mean? Like I feel good, I'm doing what I love, I'm working with young folks, I know the bread gonna come. And there's a piece of this is about faith, which is outside of the Eurocentric tradition of construction of identity and the pursuance of capital. But it's like, you know, spirituality has been extracted out from this entire conversation. And I have a full respect of folks who, you know, who can make the argument about their particular, you know, leanings or otherwise. But guess what? Black folks ain't get to 2020 without believing in something, right? Like, you know, and so the idea that faith and spirituality was a prominent strand of the identity construction of the folks who were able to overcome challenges to get us to here, while we exist in a contemporary society that is about the extraction of faith and spirituality for the sake of pursuing whatever the ideal is is deeply problematic. Because if faith and spirituality got us here, you trying to take all that out, we ain't going nowhere. And it's not about faith and spirituality in a particular context, right? It's not a particularly Christian context. We know what Christianity has done. It's not in a particular religious context. It's about the idea of connectedness, faith, belief, reflection, prayer, however you say, which is another form of meditation. But it's about those aspects of our historical traditions that need to be reinvested in. And in a practical way, Felicia, I would argue, invested in K through 12 education. This idea of education as restitution rather than a set of rescue missions, right? The idea of returning back to folks what they historically had, which means that interrogating history and what got us to here, and then constructing curricular approaches that are embedded in Black consciousness and approaches to liberation historically, concurrently with the adoption of larger standards of science, math, English, social studies. And so for me, the practical aspect is reimagining schools. You know, remember we had the Occupy Wall Street movement? You know, my move, like Occupy schools. Have Black folks go into schools within communities and demand a type of education that is robust, reflect who we are and what we are, and anchor up in the genius of Blackness. It means a pedagogy around affirmation for our people. It means a really rich and robust historical approach to instruction. It involves also situating academic content areas in Black success within those areas. That there is no mathematics without Black folks. There is no science without Black folks. Young people in schools don't know that. They don't see that. So for me, the practical way is the reimagining of K-12 education that situates itself in sort of the ratchet nose and ways of being of Black folks. Shameless plug, I got a book dropping next year. Really pick up a lot of Maurice and Ivory's themes that really anchors itself in Black woman tradition around ratchetness as a way through which we have a pathway to be fully free. Because guess what? The embracing of what society perceived as lowbrow is the path to freedom. How about that one? Like, is the path of being an intellect. Which is why I was deliberate and intentional about disrupting our pattern here, right? Because our pattern here was dope because we all got a chance to talk, but who cares who talk more or who don't? If the folks who are engaged in this stuff is heating each other's brains up. I done learned from Maurice and Ivory more than I learned in the last 4 lectures I attended by folks because of the flow. And for us to celebrate the flow and then construct policy around creating space for flow in K through 12 education. Mm-hmm. You know, for me, that's the way we make practical and tangible a lot of the robust ideas. And then that, for me, that also includes teacher education. CFA coming up in every hood trying to save people. You know what I mean? The words of J. Cole, you can't save folks who don't want to be saved. We're not trying to get saved, particularly not by you, because you're trying to save us from what you perceive as us drowning, but we swim beautifully. You know what I mean? And so it's like, don't take me out my beautiful swim to come join you on your broken boat. And it's this reimagining and repositioning that can be a part of the policy and education that has not been a part of the conversation thus far.
Mm. Okay, Mr. Mitchell, what you're just going, just like myself. What is your response to that?
I mean, I don't even know where to begin.
I know, right?
That was so rich. I mean, the one thing I would say to that is, yeah, I mean, I know that our political opponents, our enemies, people who will do harm to our community, they understand 100% of what Dr. Edom just said, right? And invest in strategies around politicizing our educational system, right? And all of these strategies are designed to do the opposite of what Dr. Edom talked about, right? So there are right-wing political causes that they don't care about curriculum and pedagogy and anything like that. They care about consolidating power. Mm-hmm. And because they care about consolidating power, they invest in changing the nature of school textbooks, right? They are, in Texas, they have spent millions of dollars of investing in making sure that people with their far right ideology are on school boards, are on various various political boards that decide the nature of the textbooks. And in a large state like Texas, right, that affects the textbooks of the entire country. So it's one of the reasons why people on the far right have gone crazy over the 1619 Project.
Yep.
Right. The reason why they're going crazy is because of their commitment to consolidating power. They know that if we have an accurate understanding of the American story, and we understand that America is a settler colonial project that is built on the enslavement of African people and the genocide of Native people, and we all understand that. Think about how that would shift how we relate in the present. They can't have that, which is why they have to attack the way that we historicize the present and the way that we attack any independent Black institutions that are dedicated to educating our young people in the way that Dr. Enum talked about. It's actually a political problem for them, right? And sometimes we don't view it in that way. Like, I often think about power, right? I'm often thinking about how are we aggregating enough independent Black political power. To me, creating those independent spaces for Black thought is a Black power building strategy, right? And they understand it, which is why they work so hard to disinvest from Black spaces, why they work so hard to interject their ideology in ahistorical ways to tell a story that reaffirms their power in the present, right? We often think about history as this thing that operates in the past, right? But it actually is always operating in the present, right? And I really love the way that you talked about STEM education, right? Because often, like, many people think about these as ancillary skills, right? Like, look, I just need to figure out how to do what I need to do. And it's like, I don't got time for calculus or for chemistry. It's like, it's these other things that are just like, I don't need those things. But if the approach was the one that you talked about, knowledge needs to be applied. That's how you could apply that, because it's about our history. So when I hear you say that, and I think about power, and I'm every day I wake up and I'm clear about who our class enemies are, who our mortal historical enemies are as Black people, and what our interests are. And I think about how that plays into every play that they make. And one of the things that I often think about, in order to sometimes some of the strategies that we experience, some of the violence that we experience, yes, it's driven by hate, right? But ultimately, there is a strategic power initiative that they are operating from in order to control Black bodies, in order to control Black communities, in order to prevent us from having independent Black institutions, independent Black political power. So a lot of, I work in politics, a lot of our political power is not independent. A lot of Black elected officials are not completely independent. And what would it look like? What would our approach to politics look like? What would our approach to any of these things look like if we had the spaces to decide for ourselves how we want to build a Black politic? Like that whole Ice Cube thing that we were talking about, what was interesting about it, and I hear so many people say this, and they think it's like the wokest thing ever. It's like, oh, you need to get off of the Democratic Party plantation, right? Okay, boom. Let's just say the Democratic Party is a plantation. What is the Republican Party then? If we're going to use that analogy, what is the Republican Party? And then why, if you're proposing this and to suggest that you're engaging the Democratic Party from this Black space, then why are you stuck in the two white-led party dynamic, that sort of duopoly? Why are you not suggesting as a third as a third alternative, an independent Black power building strategy, right? So when I hear people say that, and then somehow the answer is to jump from one white-led institution into another that is objectively worse. Whatever you want to say about the Democrats, objectively, the other white-led political institution has decided as a strategy to be the party of white supremacists, open white supremacists. You could say, and I think there's a lot of evidence to say that the Democrats, it's a coalition that includes like liberal racists. You could say that, but you can't say that and then say, okay, and now I'm going to the white supremacist party because somehow I think that that's better for Black folks. And you don't talk about independent Black political power. So I'm always suspect of people who are talking Black, critiquing one white institution, not critiquing the other white institution, and then saying, Black folks, let's go to this other white institution instead of building our own.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You made a lot of excellent points, and it's also important to acknowledge that there are Black political parties out there. There and throughout our history, we have had Black organizations that have organized in different ways. As we speak right now, there are Black people who are buying up land and envisioning an independent Black state. That's happening right now. The scale of it is small, and a lot of people don't know about it. But a lot of times when I go around and speak, I'll hear Black people talk about what Black people don't have or aren't doing, but they're doing it.
Yeah, we're doing it.
That's right.
At scale. And so, I want to touch on Felicia's question too. How do we take our conversations to action? I would first say, acknowledge what's there. Because the most important aspect of any strategy is to find the people who are at least in the proximal space of doing the things that we are saying is right. So if somebody say we don't have enough Black businesses, find the Black businesses out there and talk to them about why they're struggling.
Yeah.
And see how we could support the ones that work. If we're saying that Black kids don't have enough to do in the hood when they get out of school, there's somebody in the hood that's doing something. They may only be able to accommodate 2 kids.
Yeah.
We need to see what we could do to help them accommodate 4, and then 8, and then grow it exponentially from there. Another thing I'll say about action, a lot of times we think about action in terms of what more we can do, and particularly in the education setting. I work very closely in the education space, like Dr. Emdin, and everybody want to know about strategies. Give me some strategies. Give me some strategies. Strategies only.
Well, you said that though. I'm sorry, I gotta laugh.
Right. They only work in a certain environment among people who have a certain type of motivation. Yeah. If you don't have electricity, I can give you all the computers you want, but you won't be able to use them.
That part.
And so, in education, we focus on these standards of practice. We really need to be focusing on standards of principle, because everybody don't need to be doing the same thing, because you have a different set of students and you are a different person. So my skills would be different than Dr. Emdin's skills and Mr. Mitchell's skills. Our skills are different, and we will want to construct our learning environment in the way that plays to our strengths.
Yes.
And the students will benefit from that. And we're all going to have a different set of students. So we need to understand who those students are. So all of us doing the same thing won't work for either regard. But we all need to believe the same thing. We need to have the same values. And so in schools, they talk about what every teacher should be doing, but they're not talking about what every teacher should believe. When I talked to Tim King from Urban Prep, he said something that they ask every teacher candidate or every teacher who is applying to be in that school is, do you believe that every Black male can graduate and go to a 4-year college? Do you believe that? And if they waffle on that question, then they don't have a place at that school. So they get it. They get that the belief is more important than the practice.
Mm-hmm.
We want some diversity. In the way that society is being shaped right now, deviations from the norm helps to grow the system if you are tracking and analyzing the data properly. We don't want to
elaborate on that, bro.
So
I didn't fully catch it.
So if there's some variation in the way that we practice,
Mm-hmm.
and we're tracking outcomes appropriately,
Mm-hmm.
then we learn from that variation.
Okay.
As researchers, we need a measure of variance to understand the system better.
Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm.
But what we absolutely need to be the same in education are these fundamental values of equity, respect, going the extra mile. So you know, in staff meetings and interprofessional dialogue, we shouldn't be talking about, you know, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do this. We need to be talking about what we all need to believe. We need to be emphasizing the mission that they say that they all adhere to. So, you know, just, you know, connecting that back to actions, you know, I would redefine actions. You know, we need to stop being so rigid and thinking that actions is about an action step or something that you do, something that you see, something that you measure, and start thinking about actions as how do we change the values of the system to be consistent with right and good for everyone.
I'm about to throw a whole handkerchief at the screen right now if I had one. That was the one right there. And I think a lot of what we said. How do we reimagine action? Mm-hmm. How do we reimagine outcomes?
Yeah.
Also, how do we reimagine wealth? Yeah. You know, AZ said knowledge itself is the ultimate wealth.
Yeah.
So how do you imagine wealth? How do you imagine aspiration? You know what I mean? How do you reimagine benchmarks? And it's the expansion of all of these terms that we utilize as part of our normal discourse, that we internalize those words, and by the use of those words in their limited frames, we limit our own potential.
That's right.
I think it's in that, like that right there is the golden point. You know what I mean? Like how do we deploy different linguistic traditions and different meanings to establish ones to help reimagine what the possibilities could be. Right. And you know, in K through 12 in particular is that, because K through 12, man, their infatuation with terms, oh my gosh, I can't. I'm talking about revolutionary terms that get refashioned and repurposed in ways that like, what happened? You know, like anti-racist, it's too late. That's already done. Yeah. So somebody will tell me, you know, I engage in anti-racist practice because I told myself in the morning that I'm gonna love the children. I'm like, that is anti-racist. That's a pep talk to yourself. But the refashioning and repurposing of revolutionary language to equate to mundane practice and the making of normal practice be equated to terms that are violent on Black bodies. Yeah. Right. That part's got to be reimagined.
Yes. That is so Black, right? That's what we do. That's what we've always done. We've created language. We've created culture, and it's none of it is too precious for us, right? Like we developed the blues, and then we developed jazz, and then we developed rock.
Because it's so easy.
You know what I'm saying? And we're constantly reformulating language. So a Black person in the 80s, in the mid 80s to the late 80s sounds different. To the mid 90s, to the we're constantly coming up with a new lexicon every few years.
Yeah, we using that same old lexicon that does violence on us.
No,
crazy.
Which other people are doing that? Which other people are like constantly recreating culture every decade? Yeah. So we have the faculties to approach every discipline, every set of meaning anew. That's what we do. That's our contribution to the world. Like we refresh the operating system of the world.
Yo, put that on the t-shirt, bro. That's fire. That's fire.
Do the phones, brother. Do the phones.
Oh man, it looks like we
Okay.
ran out of time, y'all.
Yeah.
Yes, we have. And I'm sitting here and I'm saying, oh my gosh, do we have another 30 minutes?
We need
But
to find
I
food.
know that we've run out of time. And with respect to the time, Mr. Mitchell, can you take us home for a minute, please?
All right. Okay. I wasn't. All right. Well, number one, I just really, I'm so honored, and I just want to thank the Mecca. Thank you, Dean Holly Walker. Thank you, Dr. Ellison. Thank you, Dr. Toldson. Thank you, Dr. Emdin. Thank you for this conversation. You know, this was a journey that we all went on, right? And this became, and I think, thanks for the intervention, Dr. Emdin. Like, I feel like we needed to just chop it up as Black folks, having a conversation about our people and taking it outside of the traditional sort of academic panel. And I felt like we actually did some learning together. That connection, meaning, and belonging that I talked about, that I so much prize as an organizer, I feel like we actually built that together. And for the audience that is listening. And I ultimately believe that in those spaces, that's like maroon space. The connection, meaning, and belonging that we're able to create as Black folks, that sacred space in that maroon space, ultimately, that's how we will conjure the solutions, develop the action, create the learning that will transform our communities and liberate our people.
Amen.
And so grateful to be here with y'all.
Amen.
Thank you, panelists. Oh my gosh, this was remarkable. I applaud each of you.
It really
Thank you
was.
so much.
Yeah, that connection, meaning, and belonging, I felt that so much throughout this panel. I can't thank you enough, Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Toldson, Dr. Emdin. It's been wonderful to be here. I want to extend greetings on behalf of Dr. Anthony Wuto, the Provost and Chief Academic Officer, was attending your panel today, and he wanted to give some remarks, but unfortunately had to move to the next room to give remarks, but I wanted to extend his greetings to all of you and to let you know that the last panel of today is on fighting back against voter suppression. That will be from 4 to 5:30. And then the State of the University address is tomorrow at 10 a.m. And of course, we are having virtual Yard Fest at 7 p.m. tomorrow night. So I hope everyone will attend Virtual Yard Fest, the State of the University. I have to say, we are having a full homecoming in this remote space. This was an incredibly inspiring panel. I will be working on those linguistic changes. I found that so powerful to really think about language as a tool of what we're doing, especially when teaching lawyers. I'm like, that was just an incredibly powerful moment, and so many things that happened in this panel. Just to let you know, there are hundreds of views on Facebook. We have been live on Facebook. It will be up live on the Law School Facebook channel for quite a while, and we will be posting all of our panels together at the end of this homecoming weekend to be kind of a permanent repository of the incredible work that was done in this space. So thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate everyone. And I welcome our attendees to come back at 4 o'clock for the next panel. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Take care and be safe.
Sure.